Can you refuse a police officer if he demands to see your guns? Well, it depends. We're going to look at two different situations. One, if a police officer, an ATF agent, shows up at your front door and he demands to see your guns. Number two, we're going to look at a situation where if you get pulled over for a traffic stop and now a police officer wants to search your car to see your gun. Maybe they claim officer safety or something. We're going to look at both of these examples and exactly what you should do. Okay, number one, let's talk about an ATF agent or an officer shows up at your front door, knocks on the front door, and says, "Hey, buddy, listen, we have record that you purchased 2 or more weapons, 2 or more firearms, and we have record of this right here, and we need to confirm you still own these guns, you possess them, so that we can keep track of those weapons." Now, that might sound crazy, but if you don't believe me, check out this video where the ATF showed up at this man's door doing exactly that. Now, in this situation, what should you do? This is actually going to require us to take a look at the difference between the National Firearms Act weapons and non-National Firearms Act weapons. I'm going to read from the Act so you'll know the difference. So essentially, guns under the National Firearms Act, what kind of guns are those? Short barrel firearms, shotguns, suppressors, machine guns, and other destructive devices as defined under the code. They are treated differently from conventional firearms, weapons like handguns, AR-15s, and rifles. Non-National Firearms Act firearms are completely protected, and the ATF cannot show up at your house asking or demanding anything. But what about the more serious ones? What if you're talking about like a machine gun, something that is under the National Firearms Act? Can they show up at your house demanding to view these guns as well? Here is a common misconception. Many people think if you own a machine gun or something like that, that the ATF can show up and ask to be able to view those weapons. The simple answer to this is absolutely not. In fact, when you filled out Form 1 or Form 4 from your ATF forms, when you actually applied in order to be able to get these weapons, I want you to understand nowhere on there did it provide a waiver of your Fourth Amendment rights for unreasonable search and seizures. So what does that mean? Essentially, you did not waive your constitutional rights just because you own any type of firearm, whether it is a National Firearms Act firearm, which are some of the more serious weapons that we think about, or if it's one of the more conventional handguns, shotguns, those type of weapons. You absolutely do not have to comply. Now, listen, it doesn't mean that the ATF won't show up and try, because if they have record that someone purchases more than 2 weapons, many times the ATF, it'll trigger them and they'll start wanting to know what you bought, if you still have them, and so they can keep track of those. So it is actually more common than you would think that the ATF will show up at someone's door looking to find out if you still own those weapons. In fact, I did a video recently addressing a similar issue related to police officers showing up at your door doing a knock and talk. And that's exactly what we find officers do here when they show up wanting to see your weapons at your front door of your home. So if the officer shows up doing a knock and talk, wanting to actually see your guns, do you have to answer the door? Absolutely not. Do you have to talk to the officer even if he's trying to talk to you through the door? Absolutely not. You still retain and maintain all of your constitutional rights, and you have no requirement whatsoever to speak to the officer. In fact, the only way that the officer can enter into your home at this point, no matter what they're asking to see, is if, number one, you give them consent, which we've talked about, that's not a good idea. Don't give them consent. Why would you do that? Number two, if they have a valid search warrant. They must have a valid search warrant with a search warrant affidavit establishing probable cause to search your place. And then number three, they could have an arrest warrant, a valid arrest warrant. Finally, they could have what's called exigent circumstances, which is the fact you're either about to destroy evidence or commit a crime. They'd have to show some type of an emergency need in order to enter into the home. And so almost always they're not going to have any of these things, because I can tell you right now, if they've got a search warrant or an arrest warrant, they're not asking your permission. They're coming through the door regardless. So understand this, if you open that front door and you start talking with the police officer, the officer is there to investigate you. So he's going to be looking not only at you, but past you and looking to see inside the home. If there's anything suspicious going on, is there anything that could allow them to have probable cause to make them believe there's some crime going on, which would now allow them to search the entire home. Okay, so it's really important to understand that they're looking for anything in plain view is what the doctrine is. It's called the plain view doctrine. And if they can do this, that could potentially provide them probable cause to enter into the home and search it. So understand, in this situation, you have nothing to gain and much to lose, and you're extending out the actual engagement of the investigation by answering the door. Lesson here, don't open the door unless the officer announces he has an actual valid search warrant. Even then, and I talked about this in my previous video, you can then request that that valid search warrant be shoved under the door. You have an opportunity to actually review it and see it. And that is a requirement. They must present you that search warrant before you have to open that front door. If they do have a valid search warrant or an arrest warrant, absolutely open the door. You do not have to engage in conversation with them. You can say, "Officer, I exercise my right to remain silent," and then remain silent. And the only other thing I would say that you might consider doing in that situation, if they already have a valid search warrant, is to also say, "Officer, I do not consent to any search of any item whatsoever, person, place, or thing that is not expressly provided for in this search warrant." And then you need to maintain your silence. Why do I bring this one up? Because there have been multiple documented events where ATF agents have shown up at law-abiding citizens' homes, and as they show up, they begin to demand that they be able to see these guns, and they say things like, "Hey man, listen, we can do this the easy way or the hard way. If you show me now, it's going to save me having to go get a warrant and go have to search through your entire home." They will do this claiming they need to keep track of these weapons in order to confirm you have maintained in possession of them. So understand, this is a real issue. You do not have to answer the door. You do not have to engage in any type of conversation with a police officer. You can exercise your constitutional rights. The only caveat I'll give you to this is obviously, if you are in a prohibited class, you cannot possess a firearm. So in other words, if you are a convicted felon, convicted of domestic violence, there are certain provisions for which, based upon those convictions, it would be illegal. And in fact, you could be charged with a third-degree felony, which is up to 10 years in prison, for unlawful possession of a firearm by a felon or a protected class. That otherwise, you have an absolute Second Amendment right to have these items. And even if you are part of that protected class, you don't have to let them in the house. You can still exercise your constitutional rights. Okay, here's the one where we see it more frequently. Let's say there's a traffic stop. Here you are, you're driving, maybe there's speeding. Maybe you're speeding, maybe you failed to signal a lane change. Police officer pulls you over. Now they demand, "Hey buddy, I need to see any weapons you have in this car. Hand over those guns." What do you do? What do you say? Can you be quiet? Let's examine what your constitutional rights are under this example. Okay, let's get some basic common sense stuff out of the way, but it's not always common. I see a lot of people don't do this. Number one, always remain calm and collected and be polite to the officer. So if the officer pulls you over, and one of the things you need to do is keep your hands on the steering wheel at all times. Don't say anything to the officer. If you have to roll down your window even a little bit in order to provide what's required under the law, which is usually in most states, your driver's license, your proof of insurance, and in some states, registration. Although cops usually run the registration from their vehicle and they can tell whether the registration is out. But other than that, provide that and keep your mouth closed. The officer is going to then begin to engage you and ask you questions. If you choose to talk back to the officer, maybe you say, "Officer, good afternoon," or "Yes, officer," and you hand it to him. Remember, basic common sense stuff. This can be a quick traffic stop where you're on your way. If you are polite, you're calm, you're collected, you do not respond. Even if the officer starts being aggressive with you, just remain calm, be collected, and don't make any quick movements. Here's one of the things I start seeing people make mistakes. They make quick movements, they jerk, they move back and forth. This is what's known as furtive movements. I also see people do this sometimes when the officer is pulled over and the officer pulls you over and starts to walk closer up to the vehicle, and you start seeing people reaching underneath their seat. They start grabbing over to the other seat. The officer 100% of the time is going to claim you are making furtive movements, and now based upon officer safety, they need to get you out, search your vehicle, because they think you may have a weapon and they may be in a position where they could be in danger. So let's say the officer is going to write you a ticket. You're remaining calm and collected. You're not saying anything. If he writes you the ticket, don't complain, even if you weren't guilty of it. Let's say you don't think you were speeding. Just keep your mouth closed, take the ticket, don't say anything else, wait for the officer to walk off, then you can slowly drive away and end the encounter. It does you no good to start arguing with the officer on the side of the road, because every time you begin to raise your voice with the officer, he's going to then subjectively interpret and write in his report that you are now acting aggressive and combative. And this is language I see in police reports all the time. And they will use this as a basis to claim their safety was at risk, and it will escalate the situation. And there's a very high probability you could end up going to jail. Okay, so let's say the officer walks up to you. I see this happen a lot now during a traffic stop. Officers will walk up and start asking you questions which are almost rhetorical, making it sound like you have no real choice but to sound like you're guilty of what they're alleging. Like, hey, you know you were speeding too fast. You were going too fast back there. You know that, right? And if you say no, oh, you're lying to me? You're not going to admit to me and let me know this? Or they will ask you questions that make it seem like right out of the gate, you can tell they've already believed you're guilty of what they're alleging. Remember, you have an absolute right to remain silent. What you don't say cannot hurt you. So if you choose to remain silent, you can exercise that constitutional right and say, no, officer, actually, I exercise my right to remain silent in this situation right now. What is that going to do? Many times, I know some people will say the contrary, that you should have conversations with the officer, but I'm going to tell you right now, you've got to be very careful with this. Officers are experts at interrogation. They're also very good at trying to bait you out in order to have you talk. At the end of the day, you can be polite, you can be courteous, but you can exercise your right to remain silent, and the officer either has enough evidence to write you that ticket or get you out of the car, or he doesn't. You adding any type of conversation to the mix is never going to help the situation. It almost always is going to hurt it. Here's the next point. You always have the right to refuse a police search. One of the biggest areas I see people get in trouble is when they consent to everything the officer says. And I'm going to get into some of this in a second, but I want you to realize one area I will tell you this. Can you just sit in the car and not get out? Well, be very careful with this situation. If the police officer asks you to step out of the car, and including the passenger to step out of the car, they're almost always able to justify making that request. So when you get out of that car, it's really important that once you step out, at this point, do not engage in conversation, exercise your right to remain silent. If they have a legal basis, which you'll only know this later in court, if they have a legal basis to pat you down, to search you for weapons or for any other contraband, you go ahead and allow them to do that. Because if you try to stop them from doing it, get ready. You're going to be on the ground, face on pavement. Good chance you're going to be arrested for resisting arrest, maybe even assault to public servant, disorderly conduct. You do not want to go down that road. So if they're going to get you out of the car, comply on that piece, keep your mouth closed. Then we start talking about whether they actually have the ability to get into the vehicle. Oh, by the way, before I move on, many people ask me, yeah, but Jeff, what if it's very clear that the officer has no legal basis to search me? How am I supposed to address that situation? Well, like I said a second ago, don't resist. What you need to do is say, officer, I do not consent to this search, but I am not resisting arrest. You need to be real clear about this. I try to help people understand you need to verbalize what you're doing. Otherwise, that's what the camera is going to record. And many times people will say, look at the video. I was not doing this, but the officer is writing it down in a way that's saying, can't see everything on video. You couldn't see his body language, the way that he approached me. But when you're verbalizing, officer, I'm not resisting, but I do not consent to this search, you're putting yourself in the best position for your attorney to fight that potential illegal search of your person in court. Okay, so let's say the officer now frisks you. He searches you, finds nothing on you. Here's what he's going to do next, most likely. He's now going to say, you don't mind if I search your car, do you? And in fact, it will be asked in a way that almost sounds like not even a question. It'll almost sound like a statement. Like if you just remain silent and you don't immediately say that you do not consent, he may claim that you impliedly consented. And by the way, be careful of this because there are some cases out there where courts have ruled by remaining silent, a reasonable person would have spoken up, so the officer could imply their consent. So officers are trained. They know if they ask the question that way and you hesitate, they're going to claim you impliedly provided them consent to do so. So it's really important that you tell the officer, officer, I do not consent to a search of my vehicle, and then remain silent. But here's what will happen. As soon as you do that, they'll begin to ask you other types of rhetorical questions. I've seen officers do this over and over again, where once someone exercises their right, their Fourth Amendment rights to say, no, I can absolutely not consent to a search, then you'll find cops say things like this. Hey man, I thought everything was going well in this stop. I want to get you on your way. I mean, what are you hiding back here? I mean, why wouldn't you consent? If you had nothing to hide, why wouldn't you let me search your vehicle? They're going to try to play on the fact by saying an innocent person has nothing to hide. So you should allow me to ransack your car and absolutely look through and tear through everything in your vehicle. And I do want you to understand that's exactly what will happen. If you consent to a search of your vehicle, you have given them carte blanche authority to not only keep you on the side of the road for 45, 50 minutes or more, but they can actually now tear everything out. They can go through there. I've seen them remove seats. I've seen them tear things out and put it on the floor, literally digging through everything that's out there in the vehicle and removing some of it spending an hour or more doing a thorough search of the vehicle. So if you consent, you're opening yourself up to all types of violations in your vehicle and items that could be broken or destroyed because you've allowed them to search your vehicle. So what's the solution? Exercise, once again, your constitutional right to say no. Do not give consent to the search. And here's the thing. The Fourth Amendment absolutely provides every one of us a constitutional right to say no. You do not have to give consent to a search. And by doing so, in no way does that make you look guilty. I hear people say this all the time. Jeff, if I don't consent, then that makes me look guilty, and they could use that. No, they cannot use your refusal of a consent against you in court. Absolutely cannot do that. And so I want you to understand that. What they can do, though, is anything that you do consent to, it cures all. Even if they go beyond the scope of it, many times it's now allowable as evidence against you in court. The next thing you need to do is, as this continues to prolong, this traffic stop, and they continue to ask you questions, at some point, if they don't really have much to go off of and you're not giving them consent, you need to find out if you're free to go. Because otherwise, if you don't say something, the police will just continue to sit there for an extended period of time. And I know people put out there, and I see this on the internet all the time, oh, it's 20 minutes, it's this. Can I say, if you want to be able to have the opportunity to put something in place where that actual search and seizure has extended the scope of the purpose for the actual traffic stop to begin with. And here's what I mean by that. Let's say an officer pulls you over. Under Supreme Court precedent, they are only supposed to hold you for the amount of time that they had a probable cause basis to proceed on the investigation. In other words, if it's a speeding ticket, they're not supposed to hold you for an hour to write you a ticket. They're supposed to do it in a period of time that's reasonable based upon what they had probable cause for. But many times I see people just sit there, and essentially the officer will say he consented to it. It was a consensual encounter. So you need to say, officer, am I free to leave? If the officer says, no, you're not free to leave, which is likely what it's going to say, then you say, okay, well, officer, once again, I do not consent to a search of my vehicle, and I exercise my right to remain silent. And you will have to continue to ask this question. You say, well, why would you ask that? Because you're equipping your attorney to be able to argue in court that is extended beyond the scope, the legal length of what is allowed for that particular traffic stop. And it may allow your attorney to be able to file a motion to suppress and potentially exclude anything that may end up in court. Finally, look, remember, we talked about, can an officer demand to see your guns? The simple answer is, if you're pulled over for a traffic stop, absolutely not. They must have probable cause to get inside that car. And that's normally only going to happen if they can claim officer safety concerns, which I know many people say, well, they can make up anything they want. The reality of it is, though, the quickest way to give an officer that legal basis for officer safety is to make quick movements, furtive movements, act in such a way that places him objectively in fear of some type of harm. But otherwise, if you follow what we've talked about here today, many times there is no way in court that would be held as being objectively placing that officer in fear of their safety. So it's important to understand here, outside of that, if the officer tells you you are not free to go, here's what you do. At this point, if you're not free to go and they continue to hold you, you are now being detained. There is a detention going on, or they're planning to arrest you. So in addition to saying, I exercise my right to remain silent, it's going to become very important for you to also say, I also exercise my Sixth Amendment right to counsel, and I want to talk to a lawyer. This is a way for them to understand, not only are you not going to speak, but now you're exercising your right to speak to a lawyer, and there will be no interrogation. There will be no further conversation moving forward. You're standing on all of your constitutional rights in that situation. The reason why I harp on this is because sometimes I hear people say, well, I'll ask for a lawyer after they read me my Miranda rights. And once they inform me that I have a right to remain silent, I have a right to counsel, then I'll ask for it. Can I tell you right now, police officers many times do not read you your Miranda rights. And if they don't question you about anything, they're not going to read you your Miranda rights. So the only way you're going to be able to exercise that constitutional right to make sure you stand behind the protection of a lawyer is to ask for the lawyer and to say you're exercising your Sixth Amendment right to counsel. Okay, so overall, can an officer come and demand to see your guns at your home? Absolutely not. They cannot do that. We talked about it. They must have a search warrant, an arrest warrant, or exigent circumstances. And by all means, you're not going to give them consent. And then if they pull you over on the side of the road, they're not going to be able to do that either unless they can claim that number one, if you give them consent, or number two, they claim through your furtive movements or through your behavior, it places the officer in fear of their safety. Otherwise, if you're smart about it, keep your hands on the steering wheel, don't talk, and just to not have an encounter with an officer that could escalate because they think a gun is involved. Okay, we'll see you on one of our future videos.